What would you do if you had the power to shatter centuries of tradition, defy empires, and make the nobility tremble? The night of the rebellion, the night that shocked even the most hardened of rulers, holds a story that has been buried in the shadows of history for far too long. The Blood Matriarch, the woman who led the charge, was no mere figurehead. She wasn't a queen crowned by birthright. No, her rise was marked by blood, betrayal, and an insatiable hunger for power. This was not a battle for land or riches. It was a battle for something far more dangerous: control over the fate of an entire empire. But what happened when she took charge, when she unleashed her fury, was beyond what anyone could have predicted. It wasn't just rebellion. It was a message, a warning to anyone who thought the old powers were safe. But how did she do it? How did a woman, fierce, untamed, and unyielding, turn the tables on an empire that had ruled for centuries? What happens next will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about power. This story is one of destruction, survival, and the breaking of chains. This isn't the kind of history you were taught in school. It's the kind of history that scares rulers, that's been hidden from you for centuries. So stay with me as we uncover what the Blood Matriarch did on that fateful night and how her actions forever changed the course of history. Because the truth is, what you're about to discover might just leave you questioning the very nature of power. And trust me, it gets worse before it gets better. But before we continue, let me ask you, have you ever felt powerless? Like you had to take a stand, or everything would collapse? Share your thoughts with me in the comments below. And if this story intrigues you, hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed, because you won't want to miss what comes next. Now, let's go back to the night that changed everything. What really happened when the Blood Matriarch took control? Let's find out. To understand the magnitude of the Blood Matriarch's actions, we must first look at the state of the empire at the time. For centuries, it had been an unyielding machine of power, a force that spread its influence far and wide. Its rulers were considered gods, untouchable and absolute. The nobility lived in their ivory towers, weaving intricate webs of control, their every decision made in the shadow of centuries-old traditions. The elite were convinced that the status quo would last forever, that their power would remain unchallenged. But, as history so often shows, no empire can last forever. The empire was on the brink of internal decay. Beneath the surface, tensions were rising, among the nobility, among the common people, and even within the ruling class itself. The lower classes were fed up, exploited for generations with no end in sight. Their voices were crushed, their lives dictated by the whims of those who ruled from on high. The ruling elite believed themselves secure, but in truth, their grip on the throne was slipping. It was within this fragile balance that the Blood Matriarch rose. Her early life was one of hardship and struggle, molded by the fires of adversity. Born into a world that underestimated her, she learned the hard truths of survival. Her rise to power was not by accident. It was the result of calculated moves, carefully navigating the treacherous waters of betrayal, manipulation, and strength. She had no noble blood to speak of, no wealth to command. But she had something more dangerous: ambition and the ruthlessness to see it through. The empire, already stretched thin by internal strife and external pressures, was about to face its greatest challenge. The noble families who controlled the land had no idea what was coming. The rebellion would not be a simple battle. It would be an awakening. The Blood Matriarch was not just fighting for power. She was fighting to rewrite the rules of an empire that had grown too comfortable, too complacent. The question was no longer whether she could succeed, but how the empire would react to the disruption she was about to unleash. With every move, the Blood Matriarch prepared herself for the battle of a lifetime. The odds were against her. The empire's forces were strong, the nobility loyal to the old ways. And yet, she persisted. For the first time in years, the common people saw a glimmer of hope. For the first time in centuries, a rebellion was not a far-off dream, but a real possibility. But what did it take for a single person to ignite such a movement? The answer lies in the decisions she made long before the first sword was drawn. It was the alliances she formed, the seeds of distrust she sowed within the nobility, and most importantly, the unrelenting vision she had for what the future could be. She knew the empire's weaknesses better than anyone, and she was ready to exploit them. But what happens when you push an empire to its breaking point? What happens when one woman dares to challenge the foundations of centuries-old rule? You're about to find out. The night the rebellion erupted was one that would be etched into history forever. The empire had grown complacent, thinking that the Blood Matriarch's rise to power was just a fleeting spark. But that night, she proved just how wrong they were. It wasn't the clash of swords or the rallying cries of warriors that marked the beginning of her revolution. No, it was something far more subtle, yet far more devastating. As night fell, the streets of the capital were eerily quiet. The city, usually bustling with the noise of the rich and the poor, the merchants and the soldiers, seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Inside the heart of the empire, the Blood Matriarch had already made her move. In the dead of night, she gathered her closest allies, those who shared her vision of dismantling the empire's fragile structure. But even among them, few could comprehend just how far she was willing to go. It wasn't just a fight for power. It was a fight to expose the weaknesses of the system and force those in power to face their worst fears. The noble families, comfortable in their wealth and influence, had long believed that nothing could threaten their status. But on this night, the Blood Matriarch was about to shatter that illusion forever. Under the cover of darkness, her forces began to infiltrate the most secure parts of the empire. Silent as shadows, they moved, with precision and purpose. They weren't just targeting the soldiers, the guards, or the physical symbols of power. They were targeting the very foundation of the empire's control, its reputation, its image of invincibility. The Blood Matriarch understood that the true strength of an empire lies not in its armies, but in its ability to manipulate the minds of its people. The first blow came not from the clash of weapons, but from a single devastating message. A message that traveled through the streets faster than any army could march. It was a declaration, a challenge to the empire's very core. The Blood Matriarch was no longer an outsider, an enemy to be crushed. She was the voice of the people, and she would no longer be silenced. As the news spread, the nobles gathered in their opulent halls, their faces pale with disbelief. They had always been the untouchable ones, the ones who dictated the fates of kingdoms and lives. But now, they were the ones who would be forced to face the consequences of their arrogance. The rebellion had begun, and there was no turning back. In the midst of this chaos, the Blood Matriarch didn't simply sit back and watch. She led from the front, her presence felt in every corner of the city. She didn't just order her forces to take action. She was with them every step of the way, a living symbol of defiance. The city's walls, once thought impenetrable, now seemed vulnerable, crumbling under the weight of her resolve. But the real power of her rebellion lay in her ability to turn the people, the very heart of the empire, into a force that no army could defeat. As she moved through the streets, her name became a rallying cry. It was no longer just about a single woman's ambition. It was about the collective will of the oppressed, the downtrodden, the forgotten. The rebellion wasn't just about overturning an empire. It was about giving the people the power to take their lives into their own hands. The nobles, the elite, had underestimated the strength of the common people, and now they would pay the price. As the night wore on, the Blood Matriarch's forces grew in number. What started as a small group of determined rebels soon swelled into a movement that could no longer be ignored. The empire's once impenetrable walls of power had been breached, and the noble families found themselves trapped within their own gilded cages. But the rebellion was far from over. This was only the beginning. The Blood Matriarch knew that the true battle wasn't just about seizing power. It was about tearing down the very foundations that had kept the empire standing for so long. What happened next would leave the nobility SCR. The empire, for all its might and grandeur, was only as strong as the belief that the nobility was invincible. And on the night of the rebellion, that belief was shattered. What followed was a wave of shock, disbelief, and fear that rippled through the highest echelons of power. The nobility, long accustomed to their opulent lives and untouchable status, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. As the rebellion spread, the once sturdy walls of the aristocracy began to crumble. The powerful families, who had reigned over their lands and subjects for generations, now faced an enemy they hadn't even considered. The Blood Matriarch's revolt was not just about defeating soldiers, it was about shattering the very foundation of the nobility's dominance. The highborn were no longer safe in their castles. Their power, once absolute, now seemed as fragile as glass, shattering under the pressure of the uprising. The first sign of the rebellion's power came when the leaders of the nobility tried to rally their forces. In their minds, it should have been a simple matter of quashing a small uprising. But as they began to organize, they quickly realized the scale of what they were dealing with. The Blood Matriarch was not just an isolated threat. She had infiltrated every corner of their empire, her rebellion spreading like wildfire. The nobility tried to use their wealth, their influence, their connections to buy time, to protect themselves. But the rebellion was not something that could be bought off. The common people, now rallying behind the Blood Matriarch, no longer feared the power of gold or titles. They had seen their chance for freedom, and they weren't about to let it slip away. And then came the first true blow. A small, calculated strike against the heart of the aristocracy. In one night, several of the most influential noble families saw their estates seized. Their lands, once thought to be untouchable, were now in the hands of the rebels. But it wasn't just the physical loss that rattled them, it was the psychological impact. The empire's most powerful families, those who had lived for centuries under the belief that no one could ever challenge them, were suddenly reduced to mere fugitives in their own lands. What made the Blood Matriarch's rebellion even more terrifying was her ability to turn the nobility's own tactics against them. Where once the aristocrats had used fear, manipulation, and violence to control the masses, now the same tactics were being used against them. Every noble family that resisted, every lord who tried to reclaim their land, found themselves under attack, not just by soldiers, but by the very people they had once exploited. The rebellion had become a battle of ideologies, and the nobles were losing. But even in the face of such overwhelming chaos, the aristocracy refused to fully acknowledge the shift in power. Some of them fought back. Some of them tried to rally their remaining forces. But none of their old strategies worked. The streets no longer belonged to them. The power had shifted, and the rebellion was no longer something they could simply crush. As the noble families scrambled to hold on to whatever they could, the Blood Matriarch moved with even greater precision. She wasn't just attacking the nobility's physical assets, she was attacking their very way of life. The aristocracy, accustomed to their decadent lifestyles, their luxuries, and their sense of superiority, suddenly found themselves caught in a world where those very things meant nothing. The question wasn't just how the empire would respond to the rebellion. It was how the nobility would respond to the fact that they were no longer in control. They had been blinded by their own arrogance, and now they were paying the price. In the chaos of the rebellion's aftermath, the Blood Matriarch did something that left the nobility utterly rattled. she allowed them to live. They were not executed, not immediately destroyed. Instead, they were left to see the consequences of their own actions. The true power, the real weapon, lay in the nobility's ability to witness their own downfall without the possibility of redemption. They were now just pawns in a game they no longer understood, facing an uncertain future. The rebellion had done more than just capture land or power. It had captured the very soul of the empire. The Blood Matriarch's actions were not about revenge or conquest. They were about something much deeper, the rewriting of a history that had long been told by the victorious. And in that rewriting, the nobles were not the heroes. They were the ones who had failed. The Blood Matriarch's rise to power wasn't merely a result of brute force. It was the culmination of years of strategic thinking, psychological warfare, and calculated manipulation. In many ways, her ability to rise from obscurity to become the most feared figure in the empire was a lesson in the art of power, how to seize it, maintain it, and use it to control even the most formidable of opponents. She understood, perhaps better than anyone, that power is not simply about having the might to conquer. It is about manipulating the very systems that hold societies together. The noble families, the elite, had their power rooted in centuries of tradition and control. But the Blood Matriarch had a different approach. She wasn't looking to break the system. She was looking to exploit it, to turn it inside out, and make it serve her purposes. One of her most powerful tools was her ability to manipulate the perception of loyalty. In a world where alliances were everything, she became a master at turning friends into foes and enemies into allies. She used secrecy, subterfuge, and a finely honed sense of timing to sow discord among the nobility. What they didn't realize until it was too late was that she wasn't just waiting for the right moment to strike. She had already won the war in their minds. Her ability to play people off each other was unmatched. She understood that loyalty was a fragile thing, built on fear and self-interest rather than genuine affection or trust. The Blood Matriarch made it clear to the nobility that their survival depended not on loyalty to the crown, but on loyalty to her, and that loyalty was something she would extract from them through manipulation and fear. The Blood Matriarch wasn't just a ruler. She was a strategist, someone who understood the psychology of power better than anyone else. She knew how to exploit weaknesses, how to exploit desires, and how to ensure that her enemies were so focused on their own survival that they failed to see the bigger picture. One of her most effective strategies was to divide the nobility. She never sought to overthrow them. Directly, no. She made them fight each other, weaken themselves, and destroy their own unity. Through a series of carefully planted rumors, strategic marriages, and feigned alliances, she created a system where the nobility constantly questioned each other's loyalty. They were so consumed with paranoia and infighting that they failed to see the rebellion growing around them. And yet, the real brilliance of the Blood Matriarch lay not in her ability to manipulate the nobility, but in her ability to manipulate the very system that had given them their power. She knew that the empire's strength lay in its bureaucratic machinery, the network of laws, soldiers, and enforcers that kept the social order intact. So, rather than destroy it, she co-opted it. With her rise to power, she took control of the very mechanisms that had once served the empire's rulers. She placed loyalists in key positions, ensuring that every decision made within the empire had to pass through her hands. This was no longer just a rebellion. It was the takeover of the empire's heart. She became the empire's puppet master, pulling the strings from behind the scenes, watching as the once mighty empire bent to her will. But it wasn't just about control. It was about reshaping the entire fabric of society. The Blood Matriarch understood that true power isn't just about ruling from the top down. It's about reshaping the very structure of society itself, creating a new order that revolves around her. Through strategic reforms, targeted propaganda, and a complete reorganization of the empire's political and military structure, she began to create a system that was no longer recognizable to its former rulers. In many ways, her rebellion was not just a political revolution, it was a cultural revolution. She didn't just seek to replace the old leaders with new ones. She sought to change the way people thought about power, about loyalty, and about authority. Under her reign, the people of the empire began to understand that power was no longer something that came from the bloodlines of the aristocracy. It was something that could be seized, claimed, and held by anyone with the right will and the right strategy. Her ability to manipulate public perception was just as important as her ability to control the levers of power. She made sure the people saw her not as a rebel, but as a savior, a leader who would free them from the oppression of the old regime. Her propaganda machine worked tirelessly to portray her as the rightful ruler of the empire, someone who had been chosen by fate to lead the people to greatness. And the most remarkable thing? It worked. The people, once apathetic, now rallied to her cause, believing that her victory would be their victory. The rebellion was no longer just about the Blood Matriarch. It was about the future of the empire, about the promise of a new order that would sweep away the old guard and bring prosperity and power to those who had been ignored for so long. As the Blood Matriarch's rebellion continued to unfold, one of the most striking aspects of her leadership was the fear and respect she quickly garnered from those around her. In the realm of power, fear is often seen as the most effective tool. But it wasn't simply the terror of an oppressive ruler that the Blood Matriarch instilled. No, her power lay in her ability to make even her enemies respect her, to make them understand that crossing her would be an irreversible mistake. Her leadership style was not one of cruelty for cruelty's sake. Instead, it was a chilling, calculated use of fear as a means to an end. She understood that to lead effectively, a ruler must not only inspire loyalty in their followers, but they must also elicit fear in those who would oppose them. And she did so with a terrifying precision. Her reputation spread like wildfire. The whispers in the corridors of the empire were filled with stories of how she had defeated the mightiest of generals, toppled the wealthiest of families, and dismantled entire political structures with nothing but her will. The more she succeeded, the more her reputation grew, not just as a warrior or a ruler, but as a force of nature, something unstoppable and relentless. But the respect she gained wasn't just from her victories, it was from the way she conducted herself. Unlike many of her counterparts, who ruled with an iron fist, she ruled with a cold, calculating mind. Every decision she made was deliberate, every action taken with a purpose. And because of this, even her enemies began to respect her. Those who had once laughed at her rise now feared her. They feared the way she turned their own strategies against them, the way she dismantled their empires from the inside out. Her enemies soon realized that underestimating her would be their undoing, and many were quick to bend the knee rather than face the consequences. But it wasn't just her enemies who feared her. It was also her allies. The ones who had once seen her as a mere pawn in their games now looked at her with awe and trepidation. She was no longer just a player in their schemes. She was the game itself. Those who had supported her in the beginning, hoping to ride the coattails of her ambition, quickly realized that they had become subjects in her empire. She was the ruler, and they were merely pawns in her grand design. And yet, there was an odd sense of respect that accompanied the fear. Those who followed her did so not because they were forced to, but because they saw her strength, her resolve, and her ability to inspire. They knew that she would stop at nothing to achieve her goals, but they also understood that under her rule there would be stability, something the empire had lacked for years. She had become more than just a rebel. She had become a symbol. She was no longer just a woman fighting for power. She was a leader who had earned the right to rule. The respect she commanded was not simply the result of her victories. It was the result of her ability to inspire loyalty in those who believed in her cause. She had not only gained power, she had earned it. As the rebellion grew and the empire began to fall, the nobles realized that the old ways of ruling were no longer effective. They had lived their lives in luxury, relying on brute strength and wealth to maintain their control. But the Blood Matriarch had shown them something far more dangerous: the power of a mind that could see beyond the surface, that could manipulate the very structures of society and bend them to her will. By the time the rebellion reached its peak, the Blood Matriarch had become a figure that both feared and respected. Her name was no longer spoken in whispers. It was spoken in awe, as a testament to what one woman could do when she refused to be silenced. The fear and respect she commanded weren't just signs of her power. They were proof of the new world order she was creating. The empire, that had once seemed unbreakable, was now on the brink of collapse. And the Blood Matriarch stood at the helm, guiding the rebellion with a steady hand. The nobility may have once ruled through fear, but they now found themselves on the receiving end of that same fear. And what's most terrifying of all is that the Blood Matriarch didn't just conquer lands or people. She conquered minds. She had become a force of nature, and no one, neither her enemies nor her allies, could ever forget that. When the Blood Matriarch's rebellion ignited, it sent shockwaves throughout the empire. The nobility, the military elite, and the ruling classes, those who had once believed they were untouchable, were left scrambling. The empire had been built on centuries of tradition, and now it was being torn apart by a single woman's will. But while many feared her, there were still those who refused to accept her as the rightful ruler. These were the figures who would stand against her, who would challenge her, rise and seek to preserve the old order, no matter the cost. At first, the opposition's response was slow, hesitant, and disjointed. The elite were too entrenched in their privileges, too used to their power, to act quickly or decisively. They believed the rebellion was a temporary blip, just another uprising to be crushed by the imperial military. But as the days turned into weeks and the rebellion continued to spread like wildfire, the opposition realized they were facing something far more formidable than they had initially understood. Some of the most powerful families in the empire, desperate to preserve their influence, began to rally their forces. They called upon the military generals who had sworn loyalty to them, sending out commands to suppress the insurrection before it could gain any more ground. But by then, it was too late. The Blood Matriarch had already secured the loyalty of key military leaders, and her forces were growing stronger by the hour. In the face of mounting opposition, the Blood Matriarch didn't retreat. Instead, she did what few expected. She played her opponents against one another. She was a master of psychological warfare, understanding the weaknesses of those who had once been her enemies. She sowed discord, spread rumors, and manipulated their egos, ensuring that each faction was more concerned with its own survival than with uniting against her. The military commanders, once proud and confident in their ability to crush any rebellion, began to fracture under the pressure. They bickered over strategy, over tactics, over who should lead the charge. Each of them tried to claim authority, to position themselves as the one who would save the empire. But while they were distracted by their infighting, the Blood Matriarch continued to press forward, her forces now well organized, relentless, and united under her command. The nobles, too, began to turn on each other. Some sought to make alliances with the rebels, hoping to save themselves from the wrath of the Blood Matriarch. Others tried to flee, abandoning their estates and abandoning the very empire they had once ruled. But no matter where they went, no matter what they did, they were trapped in a web of their own making. The Blood Matriarch had already taken control of the empire's heart, its military, its economy, and its people. But the most dangerous opposition came from within the ranks of the empire's own elite, those who still believed in the old ways those who refused to accept the changing tide. These were the individuals who would stop at nothing to preserve their power, even if it meant going to war with their own people. Some were exiled generals, others were powerful political figures with deep ties to the imperial court. They began to plot in the shadows, gathering forces and resources in a last-ditch attempt to overthrow the Blood Matriarch. They weren't just fighting for their own survival. They were fighting for the very soul of the Empire. They believed that if the Blood Matriarch succeeded, it would mark the end of the old order, the end of everything they had fought to build. And so, they prepared for one final confrontation. They didn't just want to defeat the rebellion, they wanted to wipe it from the pages of history. They hoped to make an example of her, to show the world that no one could rise against the Empire and get away with it. But the Blood Matriarch wasn't just fighting for survival. She was fighting for something greater, the destruction of the old system, the end of the aristocracy's stranglehold on power. And as her opponents prepared for their final battle, they had underestimated one crucial thing: the strength of the people. For the first time in centuries, the oppressed, the forgotten, the downtrodden were rising up, and they weren't about to stop now. The opposition's response, though fierce, was ultimately fragmented and disjointed. They could not move as one. Their power was built on fear and tradition, and in the face of a rebellion driven by purpose and passion, it began to crumble. The noble families, the military commanders, and the imperial elite could no longer rally behind a singular vision. The Blood Matriarch had done the impossible. She had turned their own system of control against them. As her enemies turned on each other, as their ranks became filled with doubt and confusion, the Blood Matriarch moved forward, unyielding. The empire that had once seemed so indestructible was now on the verge of collapse, and her opposition had only themselves to blame. By the time the Blood Matriarch's enemies fully understood the depth of her power, it was already too late. The cracks in the empire's foundation had deepened, and there was no repairing them. Her enemies, once so certain of their control, now found themselves scrambling to maintain their positions, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The Blood Matriarch had made sure of that. As her forces advanced, she dealt with her rivals in a manner that was as calculated as it was brutal. Unlike most rulers, who might have used their power to destroy, she used it to break the very will of those who stood against her. To defeat her enemies, she didn't just need to overpower them, she needed to destroy their sense of self, to erase their confidence and their ability to lead. She knew that the true defeat of an opponent wasn't in conquering their land or their armies. It was in breaking their spirit. Each of her rivals who stood in her way was methodically undone, not by open confrontation, but through the slow, inevitable process of seeing their own resources slip away, their influence fade. One by one, they found themselves trapped in webs of political maneuvering that they could no longer control. The Blood Matriarch was a master of psychological warfare. She didn't just attack her rivals directly. She attacked the very systems and alliances that had once held them in power. The first to fall was a group of military commanders who had once sworn loyalty to the Empire. They had hoped that their military prowess would be enough to defeat the rebellion, but they had failed to account for the adaptability and cunning of the Blood Matriarch. She didn't just fight on the battlefield, she fought in the hearts and minds of the soldiers. By infiltrating their ranks with her own loyalists, she sowed confusion and distrust among their forces. Soon, the commanders found themselves leading fragmented armies, unable to coordinate or communicate effectively. Next came the noble families, who had once ruled with absolute power, controlling vast estates and wealth. As the rebellion spread, their power dwindled. The Blood Matriarch's forces had infiltrated the very heart of their territories, and they had done so without raising a single sword. The Empire's noble elite had been so focused on maintaining their own influence that they had failed to notice the silent coup taking place under their noses. Now, Unable to defend themselves, many of these families were forced to flee, leaving behind their estates and their titles. But the most symbolic fall came from the heart of the imperial court. The Blood Matriarch had made sure to target the key figures in the royal family, those who still held sway over the people and the nobility. Through a combination of persuasion, fear, and force, she systematically neutralized these individuals, turning them into either loyal allies or broken pawns. Some of her rivals were exiled, others imprisoned, and a few met with a much darker fate. As the noble families crumbled and her military adversaries faltered, the Blood Matriarch's grip on power grew tighter. She didn't simply seize power through battle, she solidified it by taking control of the very systems that had once supported the empire. She restructured the political machinery to ensure that no one could challenge her authority ever again. She placed loyalists in key positions, creating a network of individuals who owed everything to her. Through this, she ensured that the rebellion wasn't just a fleeting victory, it was the beginning of a new era. The people, once disillusioned by years of oppression, now saw her as their true leader. They rallied behind her, not out of fear, but out of respect. The empire that had once been ruled by the privileged few was now under the rule of the Blood Matriarch, a woman who had risen from obscurity and carved her name into the annals of history. Her rivals, who had once thought themselves untouchable, now realized the true cost of underestimating her. They had played their part in the old empire's downfall, and now they were paying the price. The rebellion was not just a victory over a corrupt system, it was the final death knell for an entire way of life. The old empire, built on the backs of the few, had been replaced by a new order, one that was now solidified under the unrelenting rule of the Blood Matriarch. Her rise had been swift, but the consolidation of her power was nothing short of masterful. The old empire's structures had been torn apart, and in their place, she had created a new world, one that would forever remember her as the ruler who did not simply inherit power, but who seized it with a force that the world had never seen before. The legacy of the Blood Matriarch was not one that could easily be erased or forgotten. Long after her reign, the empire she had claimed was never the same. While empires rise and fall with the passing of time, the imprint left by a leader like her was permanent. Her rise to power had been swift, but the way she reshaped the entire structure of the empire left an indelible mark that would endure for generations. What made her legacy so powerful was not just the bloodshed she caused, nor the battles she won, but the system she created. She had shown the world that power could be seized and maintained, not by brute force alone, but by the sheer force of will, cunning, and psychological mastery. The Blood Matriarch didn't just defeat her enemies, she redefined what it meant to rule an empire. Her methods were ruthless, but effective. In the wake of her victory, the people of the empire came to view her not as a conqueror, but as a savior, someone who had freed them from the clutches of the old regime. Her propaganda machine, carefully orchestrated, ensured that her image was forever entwined with the notion of strength, survival, and justice. To the common people, she had become a symbol of hope and change. To the nobility and the old power structures, she had become a nightmare. But it wasn't just the social or political structures she altered. It was the very perception of leadership itself. Under the Blood Matriarch, the traditional rules of succession and power were thrown aside. Leadership was no longer about noble bloodlines, birthright, or wealth. It was about strength, decisiveness, and the ability to control. For the first time in centuries, someone who had no claim to the throne, no royal heritage, had not only taken the crown, but had also maintained it with a grip of iron. And her influence didn't end with her reign. Her strategies were studied by future rulers, her psychological warfare techniques passed down in secret to those who sought to control their empires with similar methods. The Blood Matriarch had shown the world that leadership wasn't about benevolence, it was about dominance. Her reign was a masterclass in how to bend the world to your will. But even as she cemented her power, there were those who whispered that her rule would be her undoing. It's true that the empire she built wasn't built to last forever. The fear and manipulation that had allowed her to ascend to the throne would eventually wear thin. Her legacy, while powerful, was also fraught with contradictions. As the years passed, the people began to question whether the cost of the Blood Matriarch's empire had been too high. Her methods of control, while effective, had created a society built on fear rather than loyalty. And as the rebellion that brought her to power faded into history, the people began to wonder whether the price they had paid for their freedom was worth it. The nobility that had once ruled with an iron fist had been brought to their knees. But in their place, the people now lived in a world where power was held by a single, unyielding force. Question was no longer whether the empire would fall, but when. The Blood Matriarch had created an empire that could not sustain itself, a system of power that relied on a delicate balance of fear, manipulation, and control. Her legacy, then, was one of both strength and weakness. She had shown the world what one woman could achieve when she refused to be silenced, but in doing so, she had also created a world that was unsustainable, a world that could never fully recover from the shockwaves she had caused. Her story was told for generations, a tale of ambition, power, and revolution. Some saw her as a hero, others as a tyrant. But one thing was certain: the Blood Matriarch would never be forgotten. Her legacy was not one that could be easily erased. It was woven into the very fabric of the empire she had reshaped, and in the end, that was the true measure of her power. As the dust settled and the empire began to rebuild, the memory of the Blood Matriarch lived on, not as a conqueror, but as a symbol of what happens when one person rises above the system and alters the course of history forever. The echoes of her rebellion would continue to reverberate through time, reminding the world that no empire, no matter how powerful, is ever truly invincible. As we reach the final chapters of this story, the figure of the Blood Matriarch stands before us, not just as a conqueror, but as a symbol of the fragility of power and the cost of revolution. The empire she reshaped, for all its newfound strength, was ultimately a fragile construct, one held together by fear, manipulation, and the sheer will of one woman. But what does her legacy truly mean? Is she a hero, a tyrant, or something far more complex? The answer is not as simple as either of those labels. The Blood Matriarch's story is not one of clear-cut morality. It's a story of ambition, of power seized by any means necessary, of a woman who refused to accept the limits placed on her by society. She shattered the barriers of gender and class to become the ruler of an empire, something that had never been done before in such a way. In her world, power was not given. It was taken, and she did so with a precision that would make even the most seasoned tacticians tremble. But in her rise, she also tore down a system that, while corrupt, had long been the foundation of the empire. She destroyed old power structures only to replace them with new ones that were just as oppressive, albeit with a different face. She created a new order, but in doing so, she also left behind a world that could not maintain the stability she had fought for. Her story reminds us that the nature of power is inherently unstable. No empire, no matter how grand, can withstand the crushing weight of a single, unyielding force. The Blood Matriarch's reign was built on the idea that power could be maintained through fear and control, but in the end, it was precisely those methods that led to its eventual decay. The same fear that kept her enemies in check eventually spread to her own followers. Those who had once supported her began to question whether the price of loyalty was too high. And as the years passed, the empire she had created began to crumble under the weight of its own contradictions. But for all its flaws, her empire represented something that had never been seen before. A world where one woman, driven by ambition and a fierce desire for change, was able to topple centuries of tradition and reshape the world in her image. Her story is one of both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that in the fight for power, the lines between hero and villain often blur. And so, as we reflect on the life of the Blood Matriarch, we are left with one fundamental question. What does it mean to truly rule? Is it enough to wield power, or does true leadership require something more? Something that transcends fear and control? Perhaps, in the end, the answer lies not in the actions of the ruler, but in the world they leave behind. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed not just the story of one woman's rise to power, but the deeper, more unsettling truths about the nature of authority and the cost of change. The Blood Matriarch's legacy will forever be debated, but one thing remains clear. Her actions irrevocably changed the course of history. Before you go, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see the Blood Matriarch as a hero or a villain? Leave a comment below, share your opinion, and let's keep the conversation going. If you enjoyed this dive into history, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and check out the next video in the series. It complements this topic and dives even deeper into the history of powerful women who shaped the world.